For most of the 20th century, if you wanted to see the future, you did not look at the United States. You looked at Argentina. Argentina had everything an industrializing world was supposed to reward: vast, fertile land, a small population, a strategic position between the Atlantic and the Pacific, rising cities, railways, educated elites. By some estimates, it sat in the top 10 of global incomes. People spoke of Buenos Aires in the same breath as Paris. If you were making a list in 1910 of countries that might dominate the 21st century, Argentina would have been near the top. So how did that country become the modern symbol of serial default, runaway inflation, and stop-start crises that never seem to end? Why is Argentina today a case study in how to turn prosperity into a century-long pattern of collapse? This is not just a story about one nation's bad luck. It is about what happens when a system discovers that printing promises can feel easier than facing trade-offs, and then builds an entire political culture around that discovery. Because once you normalize crisis, you do not just get one collapse. You get a pattern of repeats. To understand that pattern, we have to start at the peak. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Argentina is one of globalization's biggest winners. European capital pours in. Railroads knit together the pampas with the ports. Refrigeration and steamships turn grain and beef into exportable wealth. A simple formula seems to be working. Land plus foreign investment plus immigration plus global demand equals prosperity. Buenos Aires fills with Italian and Spanish migrants. Grand opera houses and boulevards rise. The peso is linked to gold. For the elites at least, Argentina feels not like a periphery, but like a European country that just happens to be in South America. But under the surface, the model has some built-in vulnerabilities. First, the economy is narrow. Exports depend heavily on a few commodities. When world prices are high, Argentina looks brilliant. When prices fall, the same openness that once made it rich turns into a channel for shock. Second, wealth is concentrated. Land ownership is skewed toward large estates. Political power is concentrated too. The system produces growth, but it also produces a sense that the gains are not being shared evenly. Third, the country is plugged into a global financial architecture it does not control. British and other foreign investors finance a lot of that early boom. As long as sentiment is optimistic, money flows easily. When confidence sours, Argentina's access to funding can dry up fast. In other words, even during its golden age, the seeds of future crises are already being planted. Dependence on volatile exports. Social tensions over who benefits. Exposure to foreign creditors' mood swings. The pattern will not fully reveal itself until later, but the foundations are in place. The first major shock comes from outside. The Great Depression of the 1930s slashes global trade and commodity prices. Countries everywhere retreat into protectionism. For Argentina, built on exporting to the world, this is a brutal hit. But instead of using the crisis to diversify the economy in a measured, stable way, politics begins to reorganize around short-term fixes and patronage. A new idea takes hold. If the world will not buy enough of our exports, we will substitute imports at home. We will build our own industry behind tariffs. We will use the state to direct resources. On paper, this looks like a logical response. Many countries experiment with versions of the same thing, but in Argentina, the way it is implemented opens the door for a more powerful force: Peronism. In the 1940s, a military officer named Juan Perón rises to power on a wave of working-class support. He reads the mood correctly. People are tired of oligarchic politics. They are tired of being told to accept lower wages for the sake of export competitiveness. They want the state to recognize them, protect them, and reward them. Peron offers a new bargain. The state will guarantee higher wages, expand social benefits, protect local industry, and nationalize key sectors. In return, workers will offer loyalty, and the leader will stand above old elites and foreign interests. For many Argentines, especially in the early years, this is not just propaganda. They experience real improvements, better labor rights, visible public works, a sense of dignity. The problem is not that social protection is inherently bad. The problem is how it is financed and how the political incentives evolve. Peron's project discovers something powerful. If you control the state, you can distribute present benefits by leaning on future resources. You can tax, you can borrow, and, crucially, you can use the central bank to accommodate the gap between promises and revenue. Once that tool is normalized, it does not go away when the leader leaves. It becomes part of the system. The pattern that emerges over the next decades looks roughly like this. 1. A government comes in with a growth and redistribution agenda. 2. It uses spending, subsidies, and wage policies to ramp up demand and support allies. 3. When constraints appear in the form of inflation, currency pressure, or external deficits, there is a choice: accept unpopular adjustment, or look for ways to postpone the pain. Over and over, the choice is made to postpone. Sometimes it is through capital controls and import restrictions, sometimes through official exchange rates that pretend the peso is stronger than markets believe, sometimes through foreign borrowing that temporarily covers the gap. Always, somewhere in the background, the central bank is being asked to help. It becomes easier to let a little more inflation creep in than to tell voters and interest groups no. Inflation becomes not a one-off accident, but a habit, a way of reconciling contradictory demands on the system. By the 1970s and 1980s, that habit turns into a spiral. Price controls are imposed, then circumvented. Parallel exchange rates emerge. People who can move their savings into dollars. Those who cannot see their purchasing power dissolve. Confidence erodes, and so does the state's ability to raise revenue in real terms. The more the currency loses credibility, the more the government must index wages and contracts or offer even higher nominal returns to persuade anyone to hold its debt. The system is now feeding back on itself. At some point, the math simply stops working. When inflation runs high enough, the time horizon of economic life collapses. Why commit capital to a long-term project if you are not sure what prices, taxes, or exchange rates will look like in 6 months? Why hold local currency if you expect it to erode every week? Why trust official statistics in a context where governments have incentives to manipulate them? In this environment, politics and economics start to rotate around a new axis. Who gets hurt first and who can protect themselves? Those with access to dollars, with connections, with the ability to move assets abroad. They learn how to navigate and even profit from volatility. Those paid in pesos, dependent on fixed salaries or pensions, bear the brunt. What was once a story about development and nation-building turns into a story about survival. And yet, if you zoom out, you see the same pattern repeating: expansion and optimism, overpromising, reliance on financial repression or inflation, crisis, external help, a brief period of stabilization, followed by the temptation to use the restored credibility to start promising again. Tsolsky, the late 20th and early 21st centuries add new chapters to that cycle. At various points, Argentina tries hard stabilizations, pegging the peso rigidly to the dollar, privatizing state companies, opening to foreign capital. For a moment, these moves seem to work. Inflation falls, growth returns, the country is praised for its reforms, but again, the underlying pattern reasserts itself. With a strong-looking currency and renewed market access, politicians face familiar incentives. It is tempting to borrow in foreign currency while rates are low to finance spending without raising domestic taxes. It is tempting to use the peg as a shield to postpone needed adjustments in productivity and competitiveness. When external conditions turn, when capital flows reverse, when commodity prices fall, when investors suddenly care about debt levels, the rigidities built during the boom turn into vulnerabilities. Servicing foreign currency debt becomes harder as the peso weakens, confidence drains, the peg breaks, the system falls back into devaluation, inflation, and renegotiation. Once again, Argentina finds itself at the center of a classic picture: negotiations with the IMF, restructuring its obligations, imposing new controls, trying to rebuild a basic level of trust in its money. At this point, it is easy to tell the story as a uniquely Argentine tragedy. But the pattern is not confined to one country. What Argentina shows in concentrated form is this: if a political system finds it easier to promise more than it can sustainably raise in taxes, and then to use inflation, financial repression, or repeated restructuring to square the circle, it gradually trains everyone to behave as if rules are temporary. People start to assume that contracts will be changed, that numbers will be revised, that crises will repeat. They adapt by shortening horizons, dollarizing savings, and building informal workarounds. The cost of that adaptation is not just economic, it is psychological and institutional. Trust becomes scarce. Each new attempt at reform has to fight not only the current crisis, but the memory of past plans that collapsed. Even when reforms are technically sound, they are applied to a society that understandably doubts they will last. That is the quiet damage of a repeated collapse pattern. So what can we learn from this curve? First, early advantage is not a guarantee. Argentina's natural resources, its position in early globalization, its educated population, none of these prevented its institutions from sliding into a dynamic where short-term distribution fights overrode long-term stability. Second, inflation is not just about printing too much money. It is about a political choice to use the monetary system as a pressure valve for deeper conflicts over who pays for what. Once that choice becomes habitual, it is extremely hard to reverse. Third, external anchors are not magic. The gold standard, a dollar peg, an IMF program. These can sometimes buy time or help coordinate expectations. But if the domestic political structure is still built around overpromising and undertaxing, any anchor eventually becomes either a constraint to be broken or a mask over the same tensions. Finally, there is a broader implication. You do not need to live in Argentina to see echoes of this pattern. Any system that repeatedly avoids confronting trade-offs, prefers to roll over debts rather than write them down, and relies on ever more complex financial engineering to paper over distributional conflicts, is, in its own way, moving along a similar curve. The numbers, the institutions, and the slogans differ. But the underlying questions are the same. How much can a society lean on its future to soothe its present? How many times can it redefine the value of its promises before people start assuming that every new promise is just another prelude to a reset? On this channel, we are not here to laugh at Argentina or to declare any country doomed. We are here to map the patterns that show up again and again, golden ages that feel permanent, political bargains that grow too expensive, monetary systems used as shock absorbers until they themselves become the problem. If you want to see how Argentina's century of crises fits into the same curve as Spain's silver, Britain's empire, the Soviet command economy, and the dollar system we live inside today, subscribe to Collapse Pattern. Don't just watch history happen, see it coming. Mutar. For most of the 20th century, if you wanted to see the future, you didn't look at the United States, you looked at Argentina, a country with vast land, a small population, rising cities, educated elites, and booming exports. By some estimates, in the global top 10 of incomes, Buenos Aires was compared to Paris. If you had made a list in 1910 of who might dominate the 21st century, Argentina would have been near the top. Today, it's something else, a symbol of serial default, runaway inflation, IMF rescues, and stop-start crises that never seem to end. What happened? In this episode of Collapse Pattern, we trace how Argentina turned genuine early advantages into a repeating collapse curve. How a narrow export model and concentrated land ownership planted early vulnerabilities. Why the Great Depression pushed politics toward short-term fixes and patronage. How Peronism discovered the power of promising more than the budget could sustain. How inflation turned from an accident into a habit, a way to reconcile impossible demands. Why every stabilization, from hard pegs to privatizations, bought time but not a durable reset. How repeated defaults and restructurings trained an entire society to expect the rules to change. This isn't just a story about one country's bad luck. It's a case study in what happens when a system finds it easier to lean on future money than to settle present conflicts, and then builds its entire political culture around that habit. You don't need to live in Argentina to see pieces of this pattern elsewhere. If you want to understand how early prosperity can turn into a century of crisis, and how Argentina's story fits into the same collapse curve as Spain's silver, Britain's empire, the Soviet command economy, and the dollar system we live in today, subscribe to Collapse Pattern. Don't just watch history happen, see it coming.